Hello. This week, we're going to get inside the head of the amazing Dr. Jeffery Martin. Dr. Jeffery Martin has conducted what's probably the largest social science experiment on fundamental well-being. He's gone and identified thousands of people who have actually brought themselves into a state of persistent fundamental well-being, and then he's gone and created a methodology that can potentially help you get there. Dr. Martin is a scientist, he's a sociologist, he's one of the founders of the transformational technology movement. He creates courses at Stanford and Sophia University, and he's here with us today. Welcome, Jeff, and thanks for letting us inside your head.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. And a fan of Muse, we should say. We're all so grateful in the transformative technology movement for what you've done. You have been one of the pillars that really enabled that space to be created worldwide. And so, I don't know if people ever say that back to you on your podcast, but I'm definitely going to, because, we're just so grateful.
It's very, 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 very kind. Thank you. Well, I'm also grateful to you. I've actually been taking the Finder's course. I'm midway through. And so I've experienced some of the transitions that you have described in your book and that you have sort of brought together in your methodology. So let's start off by just describing what is fundamental well-being.
Absolutely. So fundamental well-being is what has been traditionally thought of as the heart of enlightenment or non-duality or persistent mystical experience, unitive consciousness, all these religious and spiritual terms that we actually totally respect. And, we think it's fantastic that religious and spiritual systems have been a carrier of knowledge of this state over really millennia, the rise and fall of empires. But as you know, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and so I approach things not from the lens of religion and spirituality, but from the lens of our own human nervous system and what we can do from that standpoint. So I think it's always important to note that there are so many atheists and agnostics that also are in our research data. This really does seem to be just a core change that can occur in the human nervous system. And it's at its heart, it's really a change away from what made a lot of sense back in the day, before humans were at the top of the food chain, when we really had a lot of threats and we were under threat at all times. We as a species have the same fundamental discontentment that other animals have. And that fundamental discontentment serves animals very, very well because it's okay if you have a little food, but you still need to look around for what's going to eat you. Now, we don't have that issue anymore, right? Because we're living relatively safe lives. That's not to say if you're living in a tribe in the Brazilian rainforest that this still isn't a very functional piece of human neuroanatomy, because most likely it is. You're not at the top of the food chain entirely in a situation like that. But, I'm sitting in Palo Alto, California, where we don't even bother to lock our doors for the most part. It's just so safe, I don't worry about anybody bursting in during this interview and harming me in any way or anything like that. I'm not going to starve trying to make it to the next berry bush or, wonder where my next meal is going to come from. I'm trying to resist chocolate bars and, not balloon up to be 300 pounds and stuff like that, right? And so there's been this fundamental shift that can occur in our human psychology away from sort of what we might think of as more of that traditional nature that served humanity so well for tens of thousands of years and longer, and towards a feeling that everything is okay, because really everything pretty much is okay in our modern Western lives today. And so at its heart, fundamental well-being involves that shift at a very deep baseline level of psychology. And once you have that shift, boy, everything just completely changes in terms of your experience of life. Instead of your foundational world being based on fear and worry and anxiety and stuff like that, it's instead based on, a sense that everything is okay, that you don't really need to add anything to yourself, that you're fine the way you are. There's just a degree of comfort and ease with life. It seems to genuinely be, and I think of it as a modern upgrade for our nervous system that nature is very slowly rolling out over the last few thousand years.
As I went through my own journey of letting go of my fears, I recognized that even until extremely recently, even with a deep meditation practice, I would still lie awake in my Toronto house in an incredibly safe neighborhood, an incredibly safe place. And in the back of my mind, there was still a story that a man in black was going to crawl through the window and do harm to me. And particularly as a small female, these things are just so deeply ingrained. And when I really queried it, I realized that the image in my head was from a movie that I had seen on an airplane when I was somewhere between 10 and 15 years old. And it stuck with me, and it taught my nervous system that I needed to be afraid in times when I really didn't. And it just left this fundamental imprint of unsafety, of dis-ease inside of me. And that's one of probably thousands of instances of imprints of things that my body is afraid of, or was afraid of, and completely doesn't need to be, because they're just fictions.
Exactly. And it all relates to that underlying neural mechanism, just sort of the way our brain is wired, literally the way our brain is wired, because what changes is networks in the brain with a transition to fundamental well-being. And so there's literally just a rewiring that happens in the brain from sort of that old way to a kind of an upgraded way. And so that circuitry is there to layer onto, and it doesn't just sit there dormantly as you experienced. If your spouse comes home and is like, I'm leaving you, or your boss says you're fired, or whatever else, it feels like a tiger is ripping your arm off. It can literally feel like your life is in jeopardy, right? Which is kind of crazy, because there's billions of people in the world that are potential partners. There's no shortage of opportunity in the West, economic opportunity and otherwise. And yet these things, these stories that we've built up, these conditioned fears, they lay over on top of that neural system. That neural system is constantly looking for new stories and new things that it can put, that it can basically match up to and drive us with and whatnot. And so it's brutal, because there's really nothing that can be done about that in any sort of deep, meaningful way. You can kind of patch it a little bit. You can use self-help stuff, positive psychology stuff. You can increase well-being, but you can never really get rid of that fundamental discontentment. It's just because of the way we're wired without shifting the wiring.
So you suggested that there are people who have been able to shift their wiring and who have been able to find fundamental contentment. Tell us about them.
Absolutely.
And tell us about how you got there, because you went on a fascinating research project.
I totally did. About probably 15 years ago now, I had a very successful run across media and technology and business and whatever else. And I really could have just, gone and sat on a porch or traveled around the world, done exotic things or whatever else for the rest of my life if I wanted to. Of course, I didn't do that. I was working my butt off running companies, because that's what you do. You tend to keep doing the same thing, right? But it just dawned on me, like, I'm not unhappy, but I do have that I did constantly notice that fundamental sense of discontentment. And it didn't matter what cars I bought, or how, what lifestyle I adopted, or how many self-help courses I did, or, none of it seemed to impact that fundamental discontentment. And yet it seemed to me, at least on the surface, that there were people out there that I would occasionally encounter who seemed a lot happier than I was, which didn't seem fair given how hard I was working. And of course, we're all trained that these are the things you do to get happier, right? And I felt like, I'd done all of those things. I'd made all of these sacrifices. And how could this person be happier than me? They don't seem to be working as hard as I am, or whatever. And so I really just thought to myself, if I keep doing this, I'm probably going to keep getting the same result psychologically. And so I just decided to make a massive life change. I sold the companies and all of that. I went back to school and picked up training. At that time, I had graduate degrees in business and computing type stuff. And I went back and picked up psychology and neuroscience, cognitive science, transformation, the study of how people change, which is really what I did my PhD in this specific area. Learned the best, I think, qualitative and quantitative research methods from the two best schools in that area. I think CIAS here in California, in San Francisco, is probably the best qualitative research school on the planet. And Harvard is, I think, the best quantitative research school. So I went to both of them at the same time, which neither one of them thought was a good idea, but I survived. And so it's kind of amazing what's happened since then, because I got the training I needed, I felt, to really try to ask the question, who are the happiest people on earth and how can I become one of them? It was a totally selfish quest, right? I mean, there was nothing in this about I'm going to change the world and make people happier, or it was just for me, which is why I worked so hard to get the right training, because I didn't want to be self-deceptive. I didn't want to waste any time on something for myself that wasn't working. I wanted to make sure that I had the ground truth and that I was going in the right direction for myself. Well, I got out and I started looking across these various populations, and I wound up encountering the people that I talked about a minute ago, which are spiritual people, people that are religious, people that make these fantastic claims about how they're experiencing the world. And to be honest, I thought, this is going to be psychopathology. I'm going to find a lot of self-deception. I spent, the initial part of the research project really on the lookout for how these people were deceiving themselves, or maybe they were just deceiving the public in some way, because a lot of them were the big famous teachers that we started with and things like that. And so maybe this is just some empire building thing and they're just making this stuff up, to build up 30 million followers so that they can sell a whole bunch of stuff and have a plane and, have this lavish lifestyle and whatever else. And I just could not find it. I could not find psychopathology in this population. It really seemed like it was what it was. And so then I began to really take them quite seriously and explore it. And because I had resources from my prior life, I was able to spend a fair amount of money and really all of my time. And, there was no restriction on where I could go around the world or what I could do or sort of how much I could spend to put together a participant population or anything like that. And that was a big differentiator for the people that came before me, who were often at a school like CIS or Sophia or something like that, who were more or less broke. And they would, go interview 12 people who experienced this and sort of do their best to wrap their arms around it in a little bit. Whereas I could really throw resources at it. And organize things because I just had a background in all of that. And so this was the first time, I think, in human history that was really done. And it came along, we were just lucky in terms of when I came along, because we came along at a time when the internet was mature. And so I could reach anybody anywhere in the world. Travel was easy. So there were a lot of circumstances that I think just sort of made nature say, okay, let's have some guy do this, or let's have somebody do this. And I just sort of drew that straw, I think. And so what's come out of that really has been a phenomenal categorization system across all of these people who experience this all around the world, across so many different cultures, all of the world's major and minor religious and spiritual systems, all the atheists and agnostics. What we were really doing initially was asking people cognitive science-based questions, because I was trying to sort them for neuroscience. So I was trying to sort them for fMRI and EEG work to really measure their brains and to see what was different in their brains. And those are very hard, as you well know from all of your EEG work. People often think, oh, you just get people in, you measure their brains, and then there's some magic software that tells you, what's different. But it's hard. You spent years perfecting the Muses software, which is hands down, like so far beyond everything else out there. But that's not an accident. There was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that had to go into your creation of that.
Yeah,
and
it was 10 years of solving one problem, one very singular question. Can we look at focused attention versus mind wandering? That's it. And it took probably 10 years.
And that's the way these neuroscience projects go. People don't realize that, but the average new area of neuroscience that gets looked into, and this was definitely a new area, it takes 5 to 7 years to do the legwork before you ever get anybody into a scanner. Before you ever are able to even sort of ask the right questions that allow you to do the right experiment, to get the right picture with something like fMRI or EEG. It took us 3-4 years to work up to that. So we were right sort of on par, really in the same sort of window. So what we did in order to prepare for that was ask people cognitive science-based questions, because we needed to sort things along the lines of regions in the brain and networks in the brain and stuff like that. And so you do that from sort of a cognitive neuroscience standpoint. And you do that by asking people cognitive questions and trying to get your arms around stuff. One strange and totally unexpected byproduct of that was that by asking people about thoughts, emotions, memories, sense of self, their perception, we completely sidestepped God, spaciousness, the void, you know, all the stuff that people normally talk about in relation to this. And a friend of mine, Shinzen Young, the other day told me that he's a big-time meditation teacher, but he's also a major scholar in this area. And one of the things that he told me is that there's like 70 or something, I'm not going to get the right number, but it was really high like that, different forms of spaciousness in the Buddhist literature across different traditions and sects and stuff like that, right? And so, I mean, imagine if you're just like some PhD student and you're naively going out and you're talking to people and they're using the word spaciousness, and you don't have the background and the depth of knowledge that someone like Shinzen does to be able to tell that there's 70 plus forms of spaciousness and which one they're talking. Of course, you're not going to make much progress, right? And so that had been the case before us. And just sort of by accidentally asking these questions to sort people for neuroscience scanning, we wound up being able to construct this map at a cognitive level across all of these people and really finding the common core of these experiences beneath culture, beneath their programming, worldwide. And so that alone was really revolutionary. And as I just came out with a book. It's been 10 years in the making. I didn't want to put it out. I didn't want to. My friend Ken Wilber, he always puts out books like as he learns and thinks about stuff. And so consequently, there's like, Wilber Series 1, Wilber Series 2, Wilber Series 3, Wilber Series 4. And it's like it's hard for people, I think, to really discuss and understand his work, because it's like, well, are you talking about Wilber 1 or Wilber version 4, or which version are you talking about? And so I kind of learned from watching him do that over the years, that not maybe to do the same thing. So I wound up writing this book in 2010 and then refining it over the last 8 years or so and just releasing it now, because I didn't want there to be like Martin 1 and Martin 2 and Martin 3 and lots of confusion around this work. And so this book just came out, but I have to say already from all around the world, I've heard from so many people who are like, oh my God, you're like the first person to actually write about my interior experience. I thought I was the only one. I've heard that for many years from our paper on our main scholarly website, non-symbolic.org. And so I know that those categories hold up, and I know that they hold up worldwide, not just from the research, but from random people. And they're very helpful. It's helpful to know where you are, and it's helpful to know that you're not alone. It's helpful to know sort of how to deal with this major life change.
So for people who may or may not have found persistent fundamental well-being, can you talk a little bit about what the characteristics of it are? What is it like? I know in your book you go into different levels, level 1, level 2. Walk us through some of these characteristics and the different levels.
So we use locations, not levels. And part of that is a political decision on our part, just not to make something better than another thing. And so one of the things that you'll notice as we go through, and I know you know this, but one of the things that listeners and viewers will notice as we go through is that they'll think to themselves probably, okay, well, location 1 sounds like it's good for things that maybe location 4 aren't so good for. And I think by not privileging one over the other, not saying, you're in a race, it's foot to the floor, try as best you can to get to location 3. Location 1 is nice, but boy, it's not as nice as location 2, and boy, that's not as nice as location 3, and so on, which has traditionally been done, I think, by a lot of spiritual teachers or whatnot. Religions have their own sort of favorite parts of the continuum, like the Abrahamic traditions really are big on location 3, as an example, as are some forms of Buddhism. So one thing to think about as we go through this is that rather than thinking of these as progressive levels that someone should want to attain, I think it's really helpful to think of them as which one of these most matches my current life. And if it's location 1 or 2, I often tell people I usually hold myself around the end of location 2. Now, I've experienced a whole bunch of these, but that's just the place where I'm personally more functional in the world for the demands that are on my life. As you said, I basically founded the Transformative Technology Movement, which is named after my PhD in Transformative Studies, in case you ever wondered where that name came from.
I actually had wondered that. Fact I did not know.
It was really hard to think of what to call that. We tried so many different things, and finally I was like, how about this? But so I'm doing all this stuff, and I can't be in a place that is just all love and light and bliss 24 hours a day, because for starters, it's difficult to manage resources from that standpoint. If you want to say yes to everyone, your capital goes down really, really quick because everybody gets an infinite amount of raises, and and so on and so forth. And so there's practicalities with each one of these locations. So we can walk through them real quick. So location one has that fundamental change, and they all experience it across the entire continuum. But that fundamental change is the thing I most look for at location one. Somebody basically saying, geez, now I realize I used to have this fundamental sense that something just wasn't quite right all the time. And I had all these goals, and my mind was trying to tell me, well, if you just get this car, or if you just get this partner, or if you just get X, Y, or Z, then that'll make this sort of fundamental sense of discontentment go away. Everything will finally be okay if you just do that, right? And of course, all of us have lived our lives getting an endless string of those things. Some goals we fail at, some goals we succeed at. And every time we succeed at a goal, we might get a little relief for a little while, but then that fundamental sense of discontentment comes back in. And so that change to things seeming fundamentally okay, the sense of completeness, wholeness, or other ways of thinking about it. In the location one, people also often feel larger than their bodies, as an example, like they tend to be more connected than they've experienced before that. They'll have a reduction in how quickly basically their negative emotions fall off. And so they'll have, when a negative emotion hits and when a negative emotion occurs, it'll fall off more rapidly. I like to use the example that so many research subjects use with me, which is that if you get cut off in traffic, you're no longer tailgating the person for blocks and, whatever else, right? It doesn't produce the same degree of sustained anger. It's not to say you don't flip them off or, have some choice words for them for a moment, but then, you're right back sort of to peace after that, or, these things just sort of extinguish. Now, if you have a spouse or parents or something that are extraordinarily good at pushing your deepest buttons, it can last a little bit longer, but for the most part, things kind of drop off. So that's a big change. The reduction in self-referential thinking, which is that sort of voice in your head that most people have. And, the great way to ask yourself, can I figure out what Jeffrey's talking about by the voice in your head? If you think about sort of the stream of thoughts and stuff that come into your mind, there's a lot of them that are very self-critical. Everybody experiences this. Nobody wants to talk about it because they all think, oh, only I've got the negative Nelly. Everybody else probably has the positive person in their head. But that's not true. Everybody's got the negative Nelly in their head. And so, Nicole, as my partner in the transformative technology space, likes to say, if I were to take that voice out of your head and plant it in another person, how long would you want to be stuck in an elevator with them? And the answer, of course, is not very long, right? And yet
not
we're
your whole
stuck
lifetime
with it in our head 24 hours a day, basically, right? So it's even worse than being stuck in an elevator with another person. And so that really loses its power, it loses its emotional saliency at worst. And at best, it quiets down. People often say, all of my thoughts went away, which was, when I was first starting the research, I was like, that's an astonishing way of putting that. What are they talking about? I'm still talking to them. They're able to do, calculate the tip while we're having lunch at restaurants. What do they mean all of my thoughts have went away? And what I since realized is that the vast majority of the thoughts rolling through our head every day are self-referential thoughts. And so what they were really experiencing internally was this dramatic reduction in self-referential thoughts. And it kind of made their mind feel empty once those were gone, or once they weren't as salient and sort of pulling them into those thought streams and stuff. So that's a good sort of thumbnail around location one type stuff. You experience sort of that fundamental contentment and peace and stuff, but it's very in the background in location one. There's a lot of, still have positive and negative emotions, can still be triggered by the people around you. You still got a lot of psychological conditioning and whatnot, but it's a much, much better way to experience the world. When you make it to location one, you are the luckiest person on the face of the earth. You're just so fortunate to have gotten to that place. So location two, it's a continuum. And so a lot of things just sort of continue to progress. So self-referential thinking falls off even more. Negative emotions fall off even more towards the deepest parts of location two. Your emotion is really just mostly positive all of the time. There's one big characteristic that comes in with location 2, and that is there's a form of non-duality, which if your folks listening to the podcast and watching this have meditated for a long time, I'm sure they've run across the word non-duality. But just to define it a little bit,
let's break it down.
It's kind of like it's that sense that there's just sort of one thing. That's the easiest way to describe it. And when I'm trying to just sort of quickly determine whether or not somebody experiences it, I usually ask them a couple of questions. And so one question that I'll ask them is, when you look out at the world, when you look at me, whatever you're looking at, when you look out at the world, does it seem like there's something inside here that is looking out? Does it seem like there's a looker? Can you identify, okay, this is looking at that, and there's this, and there's that.
This being I, there's a me, there's an interior.
Yeah, there's a me of some form that literally feels like it's looking out. And so I experienced that for most of my life. When I talked to the research subjects and stuff for the early parts of the research, they would describe that other version of looking, and I would be like, okay, I don't experience that version. There's a me looking out, right? So there's a very clear and distinct sense. And the other way to view it is everything just sort of showing up? When you open your eyes, is everything just sort of showing up? It doesn't really feel like there's a me looking out. It's just like everything is just sort of there. And if you feel like everything is just sort of there, there's 2 ways that can show up. One is it can be sort of everything is there, but it's just sort of out there, sort of like you'd see sort of projected on a movie screen in a way, but I'm still here. So I'm opening up my eyes and everything is just showing up. There isn't a me looking out necessarily, but there is still a distinction between I'm here and then there's everything out there that's showing up. And then there's a third category, which is when I open my eyes, everything is just showing up, including me, like I'm part of the thing that's just showing up. And so the latter 2 are different types of non-dual experience, and there are in fact many different types.
So this is fascinating as you describe it. I've gone partway through the Finder's course, which we'll get to in a bit, which is you're taking a set of methodologies and applying it to finding fundamental well-being. And as you describe this experience of looking at, I'm testing it myself. So had you asked me prior to doing your Finder's course with all the range of meditation and positive psychology exercises in it, I would have definitely answered that there was a me looking at, no question. As I sat here doing this test, I recognized that there is a world around me with stuff in it, and I was a part of it, and I am existing within it. So I wouldn't put myself all the way towards complete non-dual experience, but I definitely have the sense that the world around me and me, we're all contents of the same thing. We are all, exactly. pieces in the same bucket.
Exactly, and that is a form of non-duality. That's a totally valid form of location 2 style. Location 2 type non-duality. If people are familiar with the Science and Non-Duality Conference, virtually everybody that talks at the Science and Non-Duality Conference is in location 2. So another perceptual, some people are not as aware visually. And so auditorily, this can be done as well. So you can ask yourself, is there a listener, to my voice or to background noises or, whatever environment you find yourself in? Is there something in here listening out, which I totally remember being true for me at one point? Or does it feel like it's just showing up, like there's just, like the sounds are sort of just showing up, like they're just there? And so you have sort of these different sensory ways to sort of analyze depth of non-duality, degree of penetration of non-duality, and stuff like that. But that is the big change that occurs with location 2, is a transition into this other way of perception, this other way of sort of perceiving things that you're now experiencing, which is, fantastic.
And that I hadn't recognized. I actually hadn't identified that a shift had taken place. I think I've always been a little bit level 1, which is probably why I've gotten into the world of meditation so deeply, and always wanted to share it with other people and create things to help other people get to the state that I felt like I was in. A relatively low inner critic, a general feeling of calm. People would always say that I was tune happy. Ironically, I have a happiness gene that only 5% of the population has. Wow. So there's always something about me that was positive and joyful. So location one sort of identified with. As I was reading the book, location two, I did not yet identify with, but it was fascinating to do that experiment and recognize that I've actually, through doing the exercises you recommended, taken on some of those qualities and not realized it.
And you'll see that in the course very soon. Ordinarily, it would be the week that you're coming into, next week. Ordinarily, I would have a video that would like sort. In the previous version of the course, there was a special video that helped people to sort that week. I'm going to try to make that this week. It's a super busy week, and I'm shooting the new version of the course in real time to keep it as in sync with participants as possible, so that I don't want to get ahead of people and have canned content that doesn't resonate. And so, like, after we're done here today, I'm going to shoot the content for next week, because I'm going to speak at the Association for Transpersonal Conference, basically the Association of Transpersonal Psychology's big 50th anniversary conference tomorrow, and then over the weekend I'm doing a workshop Monday and Tuesday. So I got to get it in the can a little bit earlier this week, but I'm not going to have time to reshoot that video. So I'm going to try to reshoot it maybe Wednesday and maybe release it sometime. And it's exactly what you're saying, until you walk people through sort of these types of examples and steps, this is really easy to miss. And that's a fascinating thing, I think, because people are like, wait a minute, you're telling me that enlightenment can be missed or non-duality can be missed? Or how is that possible? And yet I like to use an example of a guy named Tom Trainer, who you can look up on Buddha at the Gas Pump podcast. He's this amazing guy in Fairfield, Iowa. Fairfield, Iowa being the epicenter of transcendental meditation, and their headquarters basically in North America and all of that. And Tom has probably transitioned more people to fundamental well-being than anyone I know of. He used to have these nights at his house where they would just basically dig into someone and dig into someone and dig into someone. Of course, everybody there is meditating in the first place. They all know what this is. They're all trying to get there. And he would just basically get together a bunch of people in fundamental well-being and put somebody on the hot seat and just pound on them until they made it into fundamental well-being. And so I think he's done like over 1,000 people, really, that he had success with in that community. Just a remarkable story. But he himself did not realize that he had transitioned until like a couple of weeks after it happened. So if you can be in a town where it's all they talk about, right, and be obsessed with it, and still not realize it until one day you're standing in the middle of the street having a conversation and you're sort of describing something, and you're like, hey, wait a minute, now that I think about it, I kind of experienced that now. And then have an epiphany dawn on you. It's kind of incredible that, you can have these amazing transitions to this whole other way of being and not realize it right away. But that totally happens to people, even to people who are so completely immersed in it that it seems impossible that it should have been, able for them to have missed it, but yet they do for periods of time. That's extremely, extremely common. We even see it in the Finders course data. People will put in their surveys, I now realize that I've been experiencing this for a few weeks now. I just didn't get it, or I didn't understand it, or I didn't think about it, or I didn't reflect on it right, or whatever else. One of the main reasons for that, I think, is because self-reflection reduces so significantly with it. And so you're not going through sort of those self-analytical processes like the ordinary person does. And as a result of that, you're not analyzing yourself like you did before. You're not analyzing things in your head like you did before. And you just miss it until something probes you. And then you're like, oh, hey, wait a minute.
Until you listen to a podcast and somebody says, look out at the world around you. How do you perceive
Right.
it? There's probably people listening to this right now saying, have I been in fundamental well-being this whole time? And actually, That's why you wrote the book, to allow people to discover the finders, to allow people to discover different states of fundamental well-being, to identify themselves in the book, or if they don't identify themselves, to offer a roadmap for how to get there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so location 3, just to finish your question, location 3 is very different than the places that come before it, but you can also see the obvious progression. It's a further reduction in self-referential thought, and all of that type of stuff. But emotional life changes considerably. And basically there is just one dominant emotion that feels like a combination of 3 different things. At its heart, it can feel like 5 or 6 or more different things depending on someone's culture that they're in. But at the core, they're going to get at least 3. One is love, one is compassion, and one is joy. Mm-hmm. And so you have sort of this composite emotional experience that's with you really all the time, unless I mean, if your father or mother dies or something like that, I mean, there can be, a ripple in it, for sure. But barring some major life incident like that, realistically, you're experiencing this all the time, and it's a dispersonal form of it. And so it takes two different forms. Some people feel it from a divine standpoint, though, so to feel like divine love, for instance. Other people don't get the divine version of it. They get more of a panpsychist version, which is a philosophical term. It just means feeling like everything is conscious, or feeling like everything has a consciousness, or something like that. And so if you think about the end of the Christian mystical path, this is their location, basically, on the continuum, or the Abrahamic traditions in general, Sufis in Islam, or whatever, Kabbalists even from Judaism. And so there's this sense of union with the divine that Christians, for instance, talk about. Their success in their own mystical path is finally getting to this place where they feel like there's this union with the divine, and this increasing sort of merging with it as they deepen in to their own mystical path. That is really location 3 in a nutshell, except that not everybody gets the divine version of it. You can also just get the sense that everything is conscious, that's what you're merging into, so this bigger consciousness. Now, interestingly, it's a dual location. Even though location 2 was non-dual, location 1 is dual, location 2 is non-dual, location 3 is dual again. The reason I say that is because you can't have a feeling of merging in with something else if there's only one thing, right? If there's only one thing, it's just one thing. There's just the one thing, and it's just showing up. And so you're not going to merge more with the one thing or less with the one thing. So people often miss that there's this subtle sense of duality that reemerges. I was having dinner one time with John Hagelin, who is basically the leader of transcendental meditation movement in North America, and also, he's run for president. He's done all this other stuff. He's a physicist and whatnot. And he was showing me a slide deck for a talk. We were both at a conference to speak. And he was showing me his new slide deck that he was going to talk, and he was like asking me to look through it with him. So I was looking through it with him, and I got to the slide that he had pulled out of the Vedas, which is, of course, the old texts from sort of the Hinduism side of the fence. And he had those same sort of 4 locations, right? He called them levels. And location, his first level, which they call cosmic consciousness in TM, was dual. And his second level was non-dual. His third level, which was, transcendental consciousness is their first level, cosmic consciousness is their second level, so that's non-dual. And then God consciousness is their third level, so that's dual again. On his slide, I couldn't believe. I thought, wow, they knew this. Of course they would have known this, right? But they knew this, thousands of years ago when they're creating these texts. And then the fourth level, which is sort of Brahman level consciousness to them, is non-dual. Again, a different type of non-duality, but sort of a deeper, more comprehensive, if you will, type of non-duality.
Yeah, that you're all a part of Brahman. You're all a part of the spirit. The spirit is you. You are the spirit.
Yeah, exactly. And so then if we talk about location 4 in our model, so location 4 feels very different than location 3. It's really almost feels like you fell off a cliff. Location 3 is really, people often think of it as the pinnacle of human experience. Like, you can't possibly feel any better than location 3. Nothing could possibly be better than location 3. And we see that in our data when we sort on positive, traits that people talk about and stuff like that. It's like a curve that goes like this for location 3 and then the other locations. It's kind of incredible. You just look at that chart and you think to yourself, holy cow, yeah, there it is in data across all of these different things like gratitude and whatever else, all these positive traits that you can ask people about. It really does seem to be maxed out in location 3. So location 4 brings a very different experience of this, and it's really a sense where you lose agency, you lose the sense that you can do anything or make a decision, which sounds terrifying to the average person. You still have agency through the first 3 locations, but by the time you're in, there's some things in location 2 where people say, well, there's no doer anymore and stuff like that, right? What they're talking about is a fundamental change in their sense of self, where it feels like sort of who they were has kind of gone away, but they still have agency, right? If you say, can you raise your hand for me right now? They'd say, sure, I can raise my hand, for you right now. Whereas if you say to a location 4 person, can you raise your hand right now? They'll say something like, well, my hand can be raised, but I don't, it's not me doing it. It's not, they have a whole other level of that not me-ness than the location 2 people have for their not me-ness. And so I think the rest of the population looks at location 4 as kind of terrifying. And even people who are in location 3 who become aware of our work are like, oh my God, I don't want location 4. That sounds terrifying. So it's kind of funny. But there's no sense of agency. There's no emotion. So the love and all of that people were experiencing, gone. Even parental love, stuff like that, gone. There's a synchronistic sense that comes. It feels like when you don't have a sense of agency, it just feels like everything is kind of magically unfolding. So it just feels like life is just one long synchronicity, or one synchronistic event after another after another. You're surprised at what comes out of your mouth as the next person. And of course, it feels like every word that's coming out of everybody else's mouth is your words anyway. So you're just like having a conversation with yourself when you're talking, that kind of thing, because it's all that deep one thing perspective. The thing that is most notable about it, those things all sound quite notable, but the thing that is most noticeable about it is the sense of freedom. So the word that is most associated with location 4 is freedom. There is so much more freedom that you experience than in the rest of the continuum, which of course is a night and day difference than normal waking reality for ordinary people. And what that really comes from is a total, I want to say almost total, but let's just say total to almost total, release of needing other people's approval. And when you don't need, even don't have a sense
that sounds
of
so
any
good.
level. Yeah, it's just like a freedom on a level that is unimaginable. And so the well-being is much higher in location 4 than it is even in location 3, which is higher than location 2, which is higher than location 1. And yet, people look at the composite description of it and they're sort of like, I don't know if I really want that. Location 3 is pretty awesome. And location 3 is awesome. I think all of these locations are awesome. Someone lands in location 1, stays in location 1 for the rest of their life. My God, they're fortunate. But one of the things that you can hear, and we could talk about location 5 and 6 and so on, but most people are going to land in locations 1 through 4. When you just listen to these locations 1 through 4, you can identify that like some of them are going to be better for some things than others, right? So one of the things that I don't put in the book, and I'm not sure why I didn't put it in, I think I probably should have put it in hindsight, maybe as an appendix or something, is that you and I and everyone else, we're really sort of interacting right now based on prior conditioning that we've built up, right? I'm sitting a certain way, you're sitting a certain way, I'm making hand gestures a certain way, you're doing whatever you're doing on your side. People are sitting there listening or watching this, and they're doing whatever they're doing. And that is all what I'm doing right now, my hand gestures, all of it, they're the result of zillions of tests that have been done by my psychophysiology on what is the most effective way for me to be in this moment. So what is it that gets the most attention from you, the most understanding of my words, right? All of my vocal cadence, all of it. It's all just programming. It's all just like a million tests that have been done up to this point by my psychophysiology. And those tests continue, right? If I think, maybe I will never gesture like this again because, maybe I will see you being like, oh, I wish you'd get done with this point so that we could get on to the next question, right? And so, okay, well, we'll never do that again. Let's try a different gesture next to it. What's the plan B gesture? So Ariel, what it is, right, whatever that switch would be. And so we're constantly have this behaviorism-based, it's the behaviorism part of psychology. We have this constant behaviorism-based programming that's constantly running experiments, constantly changing and updating our programming. And you and I and everybody else, we're kind of interacting on autopilot to some degree, based on all of this accumulated learning and conditioning. It's all just done by habit. I'm not thinking about how to move my hands. I'm not like, now rotate your hands like this while you're making the point, Jeffrey. That's what you should be doing, right? It's completely habituated. So after the shift to fundamental well-being, you and I and everybody else, unless there's a really profound change for us, like we were suicidally depressed or something and now we're happy, obviously people are going to notice a big difference. But if it's not a big change like that in our demeanor, you were already happy, right? People already thought of you as having the happiness gene. And so, there's not going to be a big change that people are going to spot in you after a transition to fundamental well-being. And people are often super curious about why in the world that is. And it's because for the most part, we're going to keep interacting with the same layer that's been built up habitually, that we're going to just keep habitually interacting with each other. But on the back of that layer, back here, there was a sense of self that was very different. Right? So there was this very sort of old school, egoic, narrative-based sense of self, however you want to think about it. And now there's a different sense of self back here. And there's a loop that goes back and forth in this conditioning process, right? So this outer layer of conditioning was informed by this sense of self before. That's what built it up. And now it's being informed by this other sense of self. But it takes conditioning hitting against it in order for stuff to come up in our nervous system, for this loop to be kicked off, for changes to occur in this outer layer. And so that outer personality layer doesn't change in people right away, oftentimes in a huge way, again, unless they were depressed or some obvious thing like that, where they're obviously not depressed anymore and people will notice right away or whatever. There will be minor changes that are noticed, but over time, over 2 years and then another 7-year cycle, there will be significant changes as that outer layer gets reprogrammed by being in a loop with sort of this newer you, this newer sort of deeper core you.
So what are so you've taken these findings on meeting hundreds of people who found fundamental well-being, and you said, how can I design a course or curriculum that's going to help the average, everyday, ordinary person find this fundamental well-being? Can you talk a little bit, A, about the process of doing that, and B, what you created at the end?
Yeah, sure. So what we actually created was an experiment. We reached the point after the first phase of the study, with the first 1,200 or so people, where we were like, okay, well, we've got our arms around this.
By the way, it's incredible that you found 1,200 people in fundamental well-being, hung out with them, went to lunch with them, figured out what was going on in their head, and then said, okay, from here, I think we can come back to first principles. Keep going.
Yeah, we've interacted with them in different ways. Some just got surveys, some got neuroscience, some got interviews, probably a few hundred interviews. I didn't go talk to 1,200 people during that first phase, but I talked to a lot of people, pretty much one a day for a long time. And so, but that was, they were already in it, right? And so the day came basically where we wanted to be able to research the change, the actual change that occurred in people. And so, you can't tell who's going to have this transition, right? And neuroscience is expensive, as you know better than you're trying to create a neuroscience product, which was, a hugely expensive quest. Neuroscience research is expensive. People probably don't realize this, but I mean, it's $3,000 to $5,000 per subject to do something like fMRI. You can't have people not make that. You can't do the pre-scan and then have someone just not change and never be able to get to do the second part, or you're just going to throw away money, right? So I'd already been all around the world. I felt like I pretty much knew everybody. I knew we had just so many methods that we were aware of. And yet it was very clear that there was no method that we could count on if we had to spend $3,000 to $5,000 per person in research
to get them to shift,
could guarantee enough of a success rate, to shift. So we ultimately had to create our own protocol at a certain point. I thought back then, well, maybe we can do it with brainstem or something like that. So we experimented. At the time I was a professor in Hong Kong, where the laws were a little less litigious. And so we experimented with all sorts of different brain stimulation, very safely, I want to say. And the regions of interest in the brain from the fMRI work by that point were too deep. And you just couldn't get to them cleanly. Now we can with the new technology that we're using. But at the time, we just couldn't do it. And so we thought, okay, well, now what? How are we going to get A/B data? We need to know who someone was before, what changed during, and who they became after. How are we going to get there? We have to get there. It's the next logical step in the research. Well, we'd asked the question that I'd ignored, actually, on our intake forms. And so, you ask people, what's your background? What's your religious and spiritual background? What practices have you done? All kinds of stuff on background forms. different than the academic measures that measure their well-being and stuff like that, just like a general information form. In fact, that's what we called it, our general GIS, our General Information Survey. And there was a question on there that asked, what worked for you? Now, you would have thought that we would have just ran right to that answer, right when we were collecting the data and stuff, that it wouldn't have been something that we ignored for years. But these people didn't seem very good at accurately reporting their prior history. And they would tell me like what transitioned them during the interviews, but then they would go on to teach different things than that. What happens is oftentimes spiritual teachers will have this transition and they'll realize, oh, well, now that I experienced it, I realize how totally wrong I was in all my assumptions about it. So I'm going to create a method that works for this, right? And then it winds up like not working for anybody, or working for very, very few people. I was just in I was just in Great Britain, and I was with a research subject. And this is a really extraordinary research subject. You can do all sorts of phenomena, create all sorts of phenomena, stuff like that. And he confided in me that he had worked with 6,000 students over his time as a spiritual teacher and had not transitioned a single one of them. The number of conversations I have had with spiritual teachers that mirror that, it's the norm. It's completely the norm. When I was first starting on this research, I was amazed by that. I was like, how can you have this many followers and not have transitioned? Like, what I was asking for in the early days, right, was, okay, thank you for this interview. Who in your community has transitioned so that I can interview them, right? Because we were just desperately scratching for research subjects. And that's when the people would say to me, I don't really have anybody for you. Or I might have one or two people for you if they've got millions of followers or something, right? But it was like the success rates were abysmal, and it was incredible. They couldn't hide it from me because I was like, hey, who else can I interview? And I was all excited about it, and they were like, well, actually, So it's kind of crazy, but so I didn't basically believe what they put on that line. I didn't want to believe what they put on that line because I knew that they had this proclivity to like transition to fundamental well-being and then think that they knew how to teach other people to get there. And I figured they were probably putting like their own methods or something on that line, or whatever else. It just seemed like that was going to be a biased answer that I shouldn't waste research time on. But at the end of the day, at that moment in time, all we had was that line on those surveys. And so we went back and we analyzed it. And to my surprise, there were a handful of things that actually rose to the top as being more successful than others. But at the same time, many people had used those same things in our research. And so it was also clear that it wasn't enough. You had to basically match up. And that was really the core finding from that first part of the research, is that A, some methods work better than others, and there's a wide disparity in terms of effectiveness of methods. And B, it's not just enough to have a list of the methods that really work well. You also have to take time to systematically work your way through them and to figure out which one is going to match up to your own psychology. We think it's psychology. We don't know what it is. We tried all sorts of things to create a protocol, like just a survey that you can take that will say, oh, go do mantras, or go do headless way, or go do direct inquiry, or go do whatever method. And that's been the biggest failure of the project. Despite all of the data that we've collected, we haven't been able to get any sort of psychological matching, at least not with traditional psychological measures, or even extracting all of the questions and saying, well, what if we view all of these questions as one giant psychological measure? Can we create a measure out of that? And even that hasn't worked. And so that part hasn't worked. But what the course does, so what we did was we basically created a protocol. And it took a while to do, but we took all of the lessons from that question on the intake form. And then we basically experimented around with it for a while and sort of refined the methods further, and we figured out, which ones work, which versions of which method work better than other things. Like I could say mantras, right? But there's like 10,000 different forms of mantra meditation out there. And so it's not enough to just know that mantra meditation is one of the things that rose to the top. We had to also answer which form of it rose to the top, and then what's the best form then to teach to people who are primarily English speakers and stuff like that. So there was a lot of work that really had to go into each one of these. Mantras are coming up for you, incidentally.
Okay.
In the
Look forward
course.
to it.
You're a couple of weeks away from them. So what we wound up with was a protocol that systematically helped people in an optimum way work through these things, and that also included things like positive psychology to avoid negative downsides, because mantra meditation, for instance, as used in the course, it's it can be very, very tricky to do that form of mantra meditation. It can really produce severe long-term depression in a small percentage of people that use it, right? Obviously, we couldn't have an academic experiment that produced severe long-term depression in a reliable percentage, however small, of people that took it. And so we had to engineer ways around that. And so it took a lot of time to do that, to figure out, okay, well, how do you engineer around these negative aspects of these meditation methods? Willoughby Britton at Brown University has a whole project around this type of stuff. And so anyway, we had to do a lot of engineering around that. What we wound up with was this complicated, initially 6 and then 12 and now currently 17-week protocol that has really had a sufficient degree of success. About 70% of people that use the protocol transition to fundamental well-being, and that's in the margin where you can spend money on that with EEG research and stuff like that, and not be throwing so much away that you have failed projects for research and stuff like that. And so that's where the Finders course comes from, and that's where the name comes from. It's about finding your method. Ironically, people wound up transitioning in it. We thought initially when I ran this, for the first cohort of 6 people, the pilot, I thought, well, we'll follow these people for a couple of years and maybe one of them will transition. And so it was really find the method that you can then practice for a while, and then, hopefully you'll transition at some point, and then we'll be able to follow up with you and do B data collection to the A data collection that we did before it, and we'll get some knowledge about this. I did not expect the 5 people that successfully completed that protocol to all transition. So I didn't even have data acquisition set up for that eventuality or anything. And so fortunately, the name of the course works both ways, because now people basically routinely become finders in it. But it was originally to find your method. It didn't mean that you were going to become a finder during the course.
It's quite a fascinating protocol that you've put together. So I so far have gone through, you've made reference to Headless Way. So in Headless Way, it's basically a variety of methodologies that get you to look at yourself and question your perception in different ways. We do general awareness. So in a general awareness exercise, what you're doing is you're actually experiencing awareness. This is in some ways different than the meditation traditions that I'm used to coming from, like it's a focused attention or compassion-based, and very well versed in those. And here I was finding different methodologies that, rather than focusing on the meditation side, which might be trying to manage your own physiology or changing your relationship to your thoughts, the methodologies you are offering are often changing your relationship to consciousness. So in general awareness, for example, you are looking around, or you're experiencing what awareness is. And you spend literally hours sitting with yourself, saying the question, awareness is, and then seeing the next thing that arises. Awareness is spacious. Awareness is everything. Awareness is empty. And often these are very, conflicting answers that you come up with, to the point where you start to simply grasp the nature of awareness. The awareness is, I would no longer even say that I have awareness. Oh, awareness simply is.
And you probably noticed in the course, we front-loaded the awareness techniques, right? And so the group awareness exercise, which is what you're describing, you do that solo, but you also do that in a group so that you hear everybody else's answers, and there's a safety mechanism with doing it in a group initially and stuff like that. But so what you'll hear this weekend, which I'll shoot after this, sitting here in the same spot, is that we're coming to the end of the second phase of the program. And the second phase of the program is primarily about awareness. And awareness is sort of front-loaded into this first part of the course because the majority of people transition from these awareness-based practices, like the group awareness exercise, Headless Way, Unprovoked Happiness. These are all really direct. They're just designed to get your perception shifted in terms of your relationship to awareness itself. And that winds up being the thing that transitions over half of people that take the program. And so if we were to just one day decide, what if we wanted to make a shorter version of this course, you could really just sort of pull out the awareness exercises and have a very profound impact on at least on slightly more than 50% of people probably.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And as I said, very different than the meditation methodologies that I'm versed in and used to. The other thing I found very, very helpful was the love-based exercises. So there's a series of positive psychology exercises that we do every morning, every night. Then there's special exercises that you get, like do random acts of kindness, imagine memories of people from the past and profuse them with love. And the thing that I have taken away from there is a practice I now do basically every day. And that is, before I do anything with anyone, I think about loving them. And so the first time I did this, the greatest transition I noticed is I got an email from a colleague who did something a little bit frustrating, and I was a little frustrated at it. Before I wrote the answer, I thought about how much I loved them. And that's awesome. All of a sudden my answer shifted. It was no longer like me being kind of snippy at them, like a little ticked. It was just this great sense of appreciation I had for everything that they did, this great appreciation for everything that was going on. It completely reframed it. And it was so powerful. I've just attempted to bring it into every aspect of my life. Being human, you of course forget. I've, tried to draw little hearts in my hands, so I'm constantly remembering to do this. But it's also changed my relationship to people around me. And I was in the bank about 2 weeks ago, and I thought, well, why don't I just do this standing here at the bank? And I looked at the teller, and I looked at his face, and I looked at him with love, and I was just like so deeply appreciative of him. And like, kind of thank God he didn't know what was going on, because he probably would have thought I was crazy or, wanting to come on to him or something. But I just, like he was my son, I felt so loving towards him. And then there was an older woman who was not able to move as well, and she was sitting in a chair the back of the bank, and I looked at her, and I just wanted to go over and sit down and like just start talking to her like I knew her and like she was a friend. And it's the kind of activity that then makes people think that you might be crazy, but what you're fundamentally feeling is this fundamental sense of openness and okay with and acceptance for everybody around you.
Those are so awesome to hear. We don't often hear stories like that back here at Finders Course Central. So I'm so grateful when I hear things like that and hear the impact that it's really having just moment to moment in people's lives. We get the little snippets at the end of every week that summarize, sort of the key changes or whatever. So those positive psychology exercises were there because they actually mitigate the negative dark night of the soul type experiences that I talked about a minute ago. That was one of the two big mitigation factors. The other big motivation factor was actually the group awareness exercise. And that is having your first glimpse of fundamental awareness in a safe spot. Because just like you can have a near-death experience where you go to heaven or you go to hell, or a drug trip that's a positive one, or a nightmare, so too can your first, experience, can someone's first sort of peak experience or first experience of fundamental well-being be negative. And if it's negative, it will often spin them out into these dark night of the soul type experiences. And so those are sort of the two things that we had to engineer around in the first, which we all front load, as you know, in the first part of the course, because we're trying to make sure that we get that mitigated as early on in the course as we possibly can. They have great side benefits. As you know, that one of the love-based exercises can transition people to location 3 quite effectively, or even location 2 or location 1 for sure. The group awareness exercises absolutely transitions plenty of people every time I run the program. So they have these great additional benefits to actually making people finders. But they actually, those techniques actually form a composite. All of those positive psychology exercises form a composite that was designed to mitigate the dark night of the soul type experiences from some of the heavier methods that come later in the course that you've yet to see. And an interesting side benefit of all of this is that when we went back and we analyzed the data years later, what we learned was that people were more likely to be successful in the course if they had higher well-being earlier in the course, either came in with higher well-being or got it earlier in the course. And so it's just sort of an accidental thing that we front-loaded with those exercises. And I think one thing that we indirectly sort of accidentally got from that was boosting people's well-being across the board sort of earlier in the course. And that has contributed, in fact, to the success rate of people transitioning. So it's really fascinating, sort of watching all this come together.
It's
But we keep calling it an
experiencing it.
experiment. We keep calling it a course. So we should probably clarify that with people. Although we put this together initially as an experiment, we ran it as a course. And so from our standpoint on the back end, this looks like a really complicated protocol, right? But from your end, I hope it's very simple. It's just a bunch of simple things that you do every week, and and it's in a class format, and all of that. And so we decided to do it that way because we had difficulty getting people to do the protocol before we shaped it like that. We would tell people the protocol, but nobody would do it. I mean, it's this long, complicated sort of thing, and you have to, do different things on different weeks. And it wasn't until we made it into a class and we made it into something that people paid for, that they actually took it serious and valued it, and then, went through it. And then we started to see the impact from it. And so initially it was just a research protocol, but we had difficulty getting research subjects, even when they were students and they were getting credit for it. Because if you think about it, it's about the length of a semester. Right?
It's definitely a serious commitment.
Reason for that.
Yeah, that's very funny.
Iteration.
Well, going into it, I'm like, can I spend the next 4 months attaining fundamental well-being, doing this for at least an hour a day every day? It's like, of course. Is there a better investment of my time? And it takes a lot of time and a lot of commitment, and it's been, challenging to keep all of the moving pieces together in my life otherwise. But the outcomes of it have proven to be totally worthwhile. It's one of those things that you front load the investment. I'm doing it when I'm 40, wish I did it earlier. Okay, yeah. I'm 39, so I did it before I'm 40.
Absolutely.
So let's shift to talking about the neuroscience of this. So what is the neuroscience of a less than happy, less than settled individual, and how through going through these fundamental shifts, what is changing in the brain, what's changing in the nervous system?
Absolutely. So I'm a big fan of giving credit where credit is due. Always. And to my mind, the key finding in this whole space was initially noticed by a research scientist associated with NYU named Zoran Josipovic. I don't know if you know him or not. But Zoran, he really hit the nail on the head. He went around at conferences. I would watch him at conferences year after year giving the same presentation, trying to get people to realize the significance of his findings. And it took years for people to realize the significance of what he was saying. And so what he discovered is that there's two big networks, and there's many networks in the brain, but there's a couple of the big networks. There are more than two. But there's one so around the early 2000s, someone at a university in St. Louis basically wondered what would happen if they looked at all of the fMRI scans for people while they were just laying around waiting for the experiment to begin. There was all this giant pool of data, right? And out of that fell something called, colloquially, the default network, the default mode network, right? And so I'm sure you must deal with the default mode network, within Muse. And so what the default mode network, it does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is it relates to your sense of self. And so if you're just sort of laying in an fMRI machine, daydreaming or whatever else, just sort of being you and not doing any tasks or anything, it lights up. And when I say a network in the brain, I'm just talking about different areas in the brain that sort of light up, or sometimes the opposite at the same time. So they're clearly sort of wired together, and they're working together, and they're communicating in some way, and then they're doing something important, and they're forming some sort of composite part of our subjective and really also our unconscious parts of our reality. And so this default mode network relates a lot to your normal, traditional sort of sense of self. It's up and active when that's more active. So if I give you a bunch of adjectives, and some of those adjectives are personal adjectives, and other adjectives are not personal adjectives, the default mode network will light up during the personal adjectives and not light up as much during the non-personal adjectives. It's a great, simple way to test that. Then the other network that's involved in this research is the task network, which is when you're paying attention to this podcast, as I'm sure everyone is, just riveted, not doing anything else, absolutely not surfing the web or running or walking or driving their car. They're just completely focused on our words, right? they're high in task. They're really doing a task. And so the task network goes up and sort of lights up at that moment. And so these are sort of contra networks to each other, right? So when the task network lights up, the default network falls more silent. And when the default network is lit up, the task network has fallen more silent. And what Zoran noticed was that there was a reduction in this anti-correlation between the task and default networks in people who were experiencing fundamental well-being. And that's a huge, huge finding in neuroscience, because we don't know of other things that really produce a reduction. That seems like core brain function that just should work that way. That like one should be up when the other's down, and the other should be up when the other. It's just like that's how things should work. But it turns out that it doesn't have to be that way. And in subsequent analysis of those findings, what he learned was that what produces that at the end of the day is a rewiring between those two networks. And in that rewiring, if you really understand your neuroscience regions of the brain type stuff, the way that rewiring happens, you can really, really see how someone is describing fundamental well-being emerging from that rewiring pattern, which I think is important from a philosophical standpoint as well, because oftentimes you will have people talk about, well, when I shifted to fundamental well-being, I could just see, I called it fundamental well-being because that's how it feels. It feels like a more fundamental state, right? I mean, the marketing people wanted me to call it extraordinary well-being because that would sell better or whatever, right? But it doesn't feel extraordinary. It feels fundamental. It just feels more fundamental, more fundamentally the case, more fundamentally okay, fundamentally true, fundamentally whatever. And I wanted the word to be an accurate description as best it can be in language of these types of things. And so this fundamental sense that comes from this rewiring of the brain networks, one of the things that's interesting is that you just sort of assume once you experience this that, oh, there was all this junk, all this mental conditioning and programming and emotional crap and all this stuff, and it was always just kind of covering over this more fundamental thing that has always been there. But I think if you look at the neuroscience, that calls that into question, right? Because there's a very clear rewiring that's happening in the brain. That rewiring wasn't there before. You weren't just like taking, you weren't making like, oh, if this part and this part of the brain falls quiet, then there's this other part of this network connections that were always there the whole time that just come to life. No, these are new connections that are happening. So subjectively, you will hear all these spiritual teachers and stuff talking about how you can never lose it. This has just been the basis of your nervous system the whole time. It's the foundation of your whole. And I get that it feels that way, but the neuroscience evidence really doesn't support that. And it's actually something quite precious that you better take care of, because it can just easily rewire itself back to the way it was before. That's actually your other fundamental way of being in the world, right? That was your default state of being in the world for most of your life. Most of your network connections in your brain, they're still wired for that, right? They can absolutely reopen the door to experiencing things like that, if you want to. Again, it takes appreciation, it takes cultivation, it takes really not letting that happen as part of this process. So I think to some degree, this is one place where some spiritual teachers and religious teachers and stuff maybe do people a little bit of a disservice by giving the impression that, oh, once you transition, you see how it really is just true nature, and it can never be anything but that, and it can never switch back. And even if it does switch back, you'll still see that there is still this true nature. Definitely not. We have had a lot of people interface with our project over the years that used to believe that, but had their old network connections come back online, and it threw them right back into their old self, essentially. And, I asked them, listen, would you have believed that could have happened from when you were in fundamental well-being? And they were like, oh, no. I would have said this could never happen, that this is impossible, that I glimpsed my true nature. It could never go back. They're like, how do I get back?
So,
how do I get back to that other thing?
So this brings up a maybe touchy subject with a lot of people, which is, you've got the sensation that you are one with the universe, and this is this, spiritual place that you've attained. And what we're looking at is a rewiring between two networks in the brain.
Yeah, I can make a case for that being pretty much just what these regions in the brain do. If you understand, here's one that relates to your spatial relationship with the world, and blah 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 blah, right? I can make a convincing neuroscience story out of this. But we also have to accept that, we ultimately have no idea why anything exists in the first place. It's all a mystery how any existence even is, right? And we have no idea what consciousness is in the brain. We have, the field of consciousness studies is virtually non-existent. Even though there's all kinds of people working on it, we're nowhere. And so, we're pretty good with subjective experience. We know if we shock this part of the brain, certain things will happen and stuff like that. But in terms of where it all really comes from and whatnot, it's an open question at this point. And so, there's people who make the case that, well, the brain could just be picking up this experience like a radio antenna, from somewhere else. And if that's the case, if you were to tune a dial on a radio, you could say, oh, well, the electronics are aligned a certain way and they're making these kinds of electrical connections and whatever else, but the radio station isn't in the radio. The radio station is somewhere else. And so it could be that sense of oneness and whatnot, it's a true sense. And the brain is just being tuned a certain way through this reconnection, sort of like the radio would be tuned a certain way with its electrical connections. And it's now picking up and it's perceiving a sort of different aspect of reality that maybe wasn't perceived before. And so I can go hardcore material scientist on you and argue a very convincing case for that. I can go less material scientist and say, we really ought to keep an open mind because, right around the turn of from the 1800s to the 1900s, I think it was the head of the Royal Academy or whatever it's called in Great Britain, which basically said, science has pretty much learned everything there is to learn. We're done now. And of course, at that point, we knew nothing, right? I think it's very important to realize that we're at the same place with neuroscience.
Well, thank you very much for taking us to a journey inside the head of somebody who's transitioned. We didn't even talk about your transition. Have you transitioned to fundamental well-being?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Which locations have you visited?
I've visited quite a few, and I'm what you would call fluid. So like if someone goes to like location 4, but they decide to go back to earlier locations, we would call them a fluid 4, as an example. Some people, they get to location 4, they want to go further. Some people, they get to location 4, they want to stick there. Some people get to location 4, maybe they want a variety of experiences. And so I'm fluid, but I usually keep myself around location 2, late location 2. Because that's a very, very effective place for what I need to do in the world. On holidays, I like to visit location 3 just because it's such an amazing way of experiencing the world. I don't have to be as productive.
Amazing. Well, if you are curious about how you might achieve a sense of fundamental well-being and be able to jump from location vacation to location, you can check out the Finder's Course and you can check out Dr. Jeffery Martin's work at, Jeff, tell us where we can find you.
Finderscourse.com is where the Finder's Course is. Non-Symbolic.org is where the research is. drjeffreymartin.com is my personal site. But if you Google me, I'm all over. It's easy to find the stuff on us.
Awesome. This was completely fascinating. Thank you for letting us inside your head.
No, this was really great. So often we deal with each other in the transformative technology space because the Muse is like such a foundational technology in creating that whole ecosystem. So this was a really nice time to be able to just chat with you about this other stuff.
It's great. I'm so glad I got to experience what you've been building.
Me too. And vice versa. We use the Muse. And as you know, we've used the Muse in the research. Arnaud Delorme just sent me back the findings as the first cut of the findings from that big project we did with the Muse. And they're fascinating. I mean, we're going to see so much. Anyway, thank you for enabling that.
My sincere pleasure. Do you want to see my kid for a second? He just came home and I hear him calling. That's when I was like, hold on. It's back.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, has it been that long?
Yeah, he's 3. Oh. This is Jeff. Can you say hi to Jeff?
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, how are you?
How are you?
I'm fine.
I can't believe you're so big. God, how has it been 3 years?
Yeah, well, he's not totally 3. Miro, how old are you?
2.
2? 2 and how old?
Aha.
Yeah, he's 2.5.
Boy, that's still a lot. Wow. Somehow an extra year slipped by on me.
Yeah, I know.
Sure.
That's awesome. It's so nice to meet you.
Yeah. Miro,
We've all heard such great things about you from your mom.
Yeah.
So I was just having an interview with Jeff, and we were talking on the computer here. What makes you happy?
I know.
What? What makes you happy?
I know.
You don't know? You make me happy. Mwah.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Much, much love. Mwah.
Much love. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.